The wind howled a mournful symphony, tearing at the ancient pines that ringed John's cabin, flinging snow like handfuls of razor-sharp dust against the window panes. Inside, the fire in the hearth snapped and crackled, a defiant orange heart against the relentless white world outside. It was a chilling winter night, one of those deep, bone-aching cold fronts that clawed its way down from the Arctic Circle, swallowing sound and movement in its icy embrace. John, a man carved from the same stoic timber as the forest he called home, sat by the window, a mug of steaming black coffee clutched in gnarled hands. He watched the blizzard rage, a familiar, almost comforting chaos. Then, a flicker, a disturbance at the very edge of his limited visibility, beyond the swirling snow and the skeletal silhouettes of trees. A shadow, impossibly tall, far too massive to be any deer or bear, moved with an eerie grace along the tree line. It was fleeting, a wraith-like outline against the white expanse, gone almost as soon as his aging eyes registered it. His breath hitched, a faint, involuntary gasp escaping his lips. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, dismissing it as a trick of the light, a snowdrift, a branch swaying just so. But then it came. A sound, guttural, primal, a howl that didn't belong to a wolf, nor a coyote, nor any creature he'd ever identified in his decades immersed in these wild lands. It echoed through the snow-laden forest, a sound that stirred something ancient and deeply unsettling within his very core. The wind seemed to carry it, amplify it, before it was swallowed again by the endless shriek of the storm. John was a man of the wilderness, a former park ranger in his late 50s, who had traded the bureaucratic confines of service for the boundless freedom of off-grid living. His cabin, a sturdy hand-built sanctuary, was nestled deep within the Pacific Northwest, a place where the mountains clawed at the sky and the forest stretched for unbroken miles. Solitude was his closest companion, a balm to a soul scarred by loss. He had come here seeking peace, a quiet refuge after a personal tragedy had ripped the tapestry of his former life to shreds. He knew these woods, every creek, every game trail, every whispering secret. He could read the language of the forest in the scat on the ground, the claw marks on a tree, the flight of a bird. His intuition was honed razor-sharp by years of observation and survival. Yet the shadow and that howl were utterly alien to his vast knowledge. This particular winter had been unusually harsh, a relentless assault of snow and ice that had begun early and showed no sign of relenting. The last plowing crew had been through 2 weeks ago, and since then, the snow accumulation had rendered the remote dirt road leading to his cabin impassable. The power lines, fragile arteries against the weight of ice, had snapped days ago, plunging him into a self-sufficient darkness he was accustomed to, but one that felt heavier under the endless storm. He was isolated, truly and completely cut off from the outside world. The deep freeze gnawed at the cabin's venerable timbers, seeping through cracks and around windows. John's supplies, meticulously stocked for just such an eventuality, were dwindling faster than he'd anticipated. The woodpile, once a towering fortress against the cold, was shrinking steadily. His kerosene lamps cast long, dancing shadows, flickering against the rough-hewn walls, making the familiar space feel vaguely unfamiliar, almost watchful. He rationed his canned goods, each meal a careful calculation against the unknown duration of the storm. The encroaching cold was a constant, insidious adversary, a frigid hand that sought to reclaim every warm corner. And then the unsettling sounds began. Not just the one howl he'd heard that night, but others. Low growls, deep thuds, and a strange, almost mournful moan carried on the wind, always from the deeper woods, beyond the immediate perimeter of his property. And at first he dismissed them as the usual nocturnal symphony of predators, a hungry cougar, a territorial bear emerging from a shallow den perhaps. He told himself it was the exaggerated echo of the storm playing tricks on his ears, his mind, heightened by the gnawing solitude. But as the days bled into weeks, and the storm showed no sign of breaking, the sounds grew more frequent, more distinct. They were too heavy, too large, too present to be easily explained away. They were becoming an insistent, whispered question in the back of his mind, a question he didn't want to answer. Please subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories. The initial unsettling sounds, once sporadic and distant, began to intensify with each passing day. A deep, resonant thrumming, sometimes a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the very timbers of his cabin, and occasionally a guttural, almost mournful howl that felt ancient, primordial. John, accustomed to the chorus of the wilderness, at first dismissed them as the cries of a lost cougar or a particularly vocal pack of wolves, amplified by the heavy, sound-absorbing snow. Yet an instinct honed by decades in the wild whispered that these were different. They possessed a depth, a cadence, unlike anything he had ever encountered. The frequencies seemed to shift, sometimes higher-pitched, sometimes so low they were felt more than heard, resonating in his chest. The snow, a thick, unblemished blanket across his isolated property, became a canvas for revelation. One frigid morning, while checking his meager supply of firewood near the edge of the tree line, John stumbled upon them. Massive depressions in the fresh powder, too large, too distinct to be any bear or deer. Each imprint was easily twice the size of his own size 12 boot, etched with a clear, five-toed pattern, spaced impossibly far apart, indicating a creature of immense stride. He measured one with his gloved hand, the width easily spanning his entire palm and fingers, deeply pressed into the hard-packed snow. A shiver, not from the cold, snaked down his spine. He followed a short trail, a mere 20 yards, that led directly from the dense woods to the perimeter of his small clearing, before mysteriously disappearing back into the thicket, as if the creature had simply vanished into the shadows. These tracks appeared with increasing frequency, sometimes circling his cabin in the dead of night, other times leading from the frozen creek bed to the very steps of his porch. The orderly patterns of a known animal were absent. These were haphazard, deliberate, and undeniably curious. His peaceful solitude, once a balm to his soul, now began to twist into a menacing isolation. The towering, snow-laden pines that cradled his cabin no longer offered comfort, but instead seemed to harbor an unseen observer. John felt an undeniable sensation of being watched, a prickling awareness at the back of his neck, especially when he ventured outside or tended to his dwindling supplies. The air itself felt charged with an unseen presence, a heavy, expectant silence that would fall over the forest just before the strange calls began anew. He tried to rationalize it. A peculiar bear, perhaps, driven out of hibernation by the unprecedented cold, or a new species of wolf he hadn't known existed. But his naturalist's mind rejected these easy answers. The tracks were too consistent, too unique, the sounds too complex. He started fortifying his cabin, not with fear-driven panic, but with a hunter's methodical preparedness. He secured the shutters, double-checked the locks on his reinforced door, and cleared the snow from around his windows, creating clear lines of sight. His old hunting rifle, usually gathering dust, was cleaned and placed near his bedside, a silent, weighty presence. He checked his scarce hunting traps, mostly for rabbits and squirrels, ensuring their integrity, though his heart wasn't truly in it. The thought of inflicting harm on any creature, especially one struggling in this brutal winter, felt wrong. Instead, a different impulse began to stir within him, an act of his inherent empathy, born from years of observing the brutal yet beautiful cycle of life and death in the wilderness. He remembered seeing a wounded deer once, struggling through a harsh winter, and his own quiet efforts to leave it forage. One evening, as the strange calls echoed closer than ever before, a deep, mournful sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the endless winter, John found himself instinctively reaching for a small portion of his precious dried venison. He sliced a generous chunk, then added a handful of dried berries and nuts, a small yet significant offering from his own meager store. He walked to the edge of his porch, the porch light casting a weak yellow circle onto the shimmering snow, and placed the offering gently on a flat, snow-covered rock. He then retreated inside, extinguishing the light, and pressed his face to the cold window pane, peering out into the impenetrable darkness, waiting. He didn't know what he was waiting for, or even why he had done it. It was simply an act of human compassion, born from the crushing loneliness and the stark reality of survival in the face of the unforgiving cold. The vast, silent forest offered no immediate answer, only the continued, watchful quiet. The blizzard raged outside, a swirling vortex of white, muffling the world beyond the cabin walls. John, hunched by the flickering fire, listened to the wind howl like a mournful spirit. His dwindling supplies weighed heavily on his mind, each gust a reminder of his precarious isolation. He had just finished a meager supper, mostly broth, when a subtle shift in the storm's cacophony caught his attention. It wasn't the wind nor the groan of ancient pines, but something else. A rhythmic crunching, unnaturally heavy, fighting against the deep snow. He moved cautiously to the window, peering through a small cleared patch on the frost-covered pane. His breath hitched. At the very edge of his property, where the cleared land met the impenetrable wall of trees, a massive, dark figure materialized from the driving snow. It moved with an eerie, almost unnatural fluidity for its size. Yet every step seemed a monumental effort against the biting wind and knee-deep drifts. It was impossibly tall, broad, and covered in what looked like shaggy dark hair, glistening with ice. John's heart hammered against his ribs, a primal fear seizing him, freezing him in place. This was no bear, no moose, no creature he had ever encountered in his decades of wilderness living. The scale of it was simply staggering. But then, as a fresh gust nearly bowled the creature over, John noticed something else. Its movements, though powerful, were labored, almost pained. It stumbled, recovering with immense effort, its head bowed against the assault of the storm. A strange sense of empathy, a flicker of his former self, a ghost of the park ranger who had once rescued countless injured animals, stirred within him. This colossal being, whatever it was suffering. It was fighting for survival just as he was, against the merciless grip of winter. The raw, instinctual fear began to recede, replaced by a profound, almost illogical compassion. The sheer desperation of the creature was palpable, radiating even through the whiteout. He watched for what felt like an eternity, the figure a stark, stoic sentinel against the raging storm, before it slowly turned, its gaze seeming to pierce the white veil and land directly on his cabin. He instinctively recoiled, but the creature made no aggressive move. It simply stood, a monument to endurance, before slowly, deliberately, turning back towards the tree line, every step a struggle. A decision solidified in John's mind, born of that strange empathy. He had a pot of venison stew, his last substantial meal for days, simmering gently on the wood stove. It was rich, hearty, and would provide much-needed warmth and sustenance. It was a relic of better times, a comfort food he had planned to savor. But looking at the struggling Titan outside, his priorities shifted. His own hunger receded into the background. With trembling hands, John ladled a generous portion of the steaming stew into his largest metal pot. He grabbed a thick pair of gloves, pulled on his heavy winter coat, and with a deep breath, opened the cabin door. The wind howled a furious greeting, tearing at his clothes. He placed the pot carefully on the sturdy wooden stump near the edge of his property, about 20 yards from the cabin, where the tracks had been most visible. Then he retreated quickly, closing the door and peering through the window once more. He waited, barely breathing, for what seemed an age. The blizzard continued its relentless assault. Then, slowly, cautiously, the massive figure re-emerged from the swirling snow. It moved with an almost ethereal silence, approaching the stump, its head, massive and powerful, lowered, sniffing the air. John watched, mesmerized, as it knelt, its movements surprisingly gentle for such a formidable beast. It dipped a hand, astonishingly human-like in its dexterity, into the stew, then brought it to its mouth. The creature ate slowly, deliberately, every mouthful a testament to its hunger and the harshness of its existence. There was no ravenous gorging, no animalistic tear, just a powerful, almost reverent consumption. John saw the steam rise from its massive form, momentarily swirling around its face, before dissipating into the storm. In that moment, a profound silent understanding passed between them, though separated by glass and swirling snow. He felt a connection, an unspoken acknowledgement of shared vulnerability in the face of nature's raw power. When the pot was empty, the creature lingered for a moment, its immense frame silhouetted against the blizzard. Then it rose, turning one last time towards the cabin before melting back into the white chaos of the forest. From that night forward, John began leaving food out regularly. He knew the risks, but the image of that struggling figure, the quiet dignity of its consumption, had imprinted itself upon his soul. He started calling the creature softly to himself, Snow Shadow. It was a name born of observation, of reverence, and of a burgeoning, improbable friendship in the heart of a frozen wilderness. Each evening, he would leave out a portion of his increasingly precious rations, and each morning, the pot would be empty, often with the snow around it silently smoothed, as if to denote gratitude. The silent compact deepened with each passing day. The silent compact deepened with each passing day, weaving an invisible thread between John and Snow Shadow. John religiously continued his evening ritual, placing carefully portioned food outside his cabin, a silent offering to the wilderness. He learned to gauge the creature's needs, sometimes leaving out more when the cold was particularly bitter, other times less when signs suggested it had found its own sustenance. This act of sustained generosity, at great personal cost given his dwindling supplies, brought a strange, unexpected sense of routine and even purpose to his otherwise solitary existence. He wasn't just surviving, he was providing, nurturing a connection that defied logic and explanation. In return, Snow Shadow, in its own enigmatic way, seemed to acknowledge John's kindness. There were no overt gestures, No direct interactions, but subtle indications began appearing around his property. One morning, John found a small pile of berries, deep crimson against the white snow, neatly placed on his porch step. Berries he hadn't seen growing in this part of the forest. Another time, he discovered a collection of finely woven grasses, intricate in their design, left beside the empty food pot. These weren't random occurrences. They felt deliberate, a reciprocal token of appreciation from a creature far more intelligent than any animal John had ever encountered. These silent gifts reinforced his conviction that Snow Shadow wasn't just a brute beast. It was a sentient being, capable of gratitude, and perhaps even a unique form of communication. This burgeoning, improbable bond began to subtly transform John. The gnawing loneliness that had settled deep within him after years of self-imposed isolation started to recede, replaced by a quiet companionship. He found himself looking forward to the evenings, to the anticipation of Snow Shadow's visit, to the small mysteries left behind. His life, once solely focused on survival and introspection, now had an external focus, a shared secret that brought an unexpected warmth to the heart of the frozen wilderness. He felt less like a hermit and more like a guardian, committed to this strange, powerful, and gentle giant. However, this fragile, peaceful coexistence was not destined to last. As the days slowly lengthened and the iron grip of winter began to loosen its hold, a new, unsettling element began to intrude upon John's sanctuary. The snow, though still deep, started to show signs of melting, revealing patches of frozen earth. With the abatement of the storm's fury came a new kind of sound, one that sent a shiver of unease down John's spine. Faint at first, carried on the crisp morning air, it was the unmistakable rumble of heavy machinery. It wasn't the natural groan of shifting ice or the distant roar of an avalanche. This was manufactured, metallic, an alien intrusion into the pristine silence of his wilderness. John listened intently, his brow furrowing with concern. The sounds were sporadic, sometimes accompanied by a muffled clang or a distant, rhythmic thud. It suggested large vehicles, perhaps even earth-moving equipment, making their way slowly but inexorably closer. The remote logging roads, usually impassable until late spring, must have been cleared or were being cleared. His hard-won solitude, his carefully constructed haven, felt suddenly vulnerable. He had sought this isolation precisely to escape the clamor of the modern world, and now that world, in its most industrial and intrusive form, seemed to be knocking at his door. A growing sense of apprehension settled over him. What could possibly be bringing such heavy equipment into this desolate region earlier than usual? His ranger instincts, long dormant, began to reawaken, signaling danger. He worried not only for his own peace, but, more acutely, for Snow Shadow. The creature was a master of stealth, a phantom of the forest, but it was also a being of immense size, inherently vulnerable to the prying eyes and destructive forces of human civilization. Then, one morning, John stepped outside for his usual perimeter check and noticed something deeply disturbing near the boundary of his property. Mixed with the fading tracks of deer and elk, and even a few of Snow Shadow's unmistakable impressions, were other footprints. These were distinctly human, but unlike any he had seen from the occasional trapper or lost hiker. They were heavy, deep, and numerous, suggesting multiple individuals. What truly unsettled him was their pattern, methodical, almost military-like, suggesting a deliberate search rather than casual exploration. They crisscrossed the area, often leading off into denser thickets, where no ordinary person would venture without a clear purpose. The human tracks were not random. They skirted the edges of his property, sometimes venturing closer than comfort allowed, before veering off into the deeper woods. These weren't the aimless wanderings of a lost soul. They were purposeful, investigative. John felt a cold dread seep into his bones. Someone was actively scouting, exploring, looking for something specific. His gaze instinctively turned towards the silent, towering trees where snow shadow often disappeared. The gifts of berries and woven grasses, once comforting symbols of a unique bond, now seemed like markers of a presence that others might also discern. The serene wilderness, once his sanctuary, had suddenly become a potential stage for an unwelcome and dangerous confrontation. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that the peaceful, hidden life he had built, shared only with the enigmatic snow shadow, was about to be irrevocably shattered. The intrusion was no longer distant. It was at his doorstep. The silent compact deepened with each passing day. John shared his meager existence, and Snow Shadow, in its own mysterious way, seemed to reciprocate. He would often find strange offerings near the stump where he left the food, carefully arranged piles of unusual, vibrant berries that grew only in deep, hidden alcoves, or intricate patterns of woven grasses, unlike anything he'd ever seen crafted by man or beast. These were not mere trinkets. They were tokens of intelligence, of a deliberate, thoughtful connection. John felt a burgeoning sense of peace, a quiet satisfaction in this improbable companionship. He was no longer entirely alone in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. His purpose had expanded beyond mere survival. Now, it included the safeguarding of this magnificent, hidden life. The harshest grip of winter began to loosen its hold, the relentless blizzards giving way to more moderate snowfall, the biting winds softening slightly. Yet, even as the immediate threat of starvation and freezing receded, a new, more insidious anxiety began to creep into John's carefully constructed solitude. Distant sounds, faint at first, then growing steadily clearer, started to penetrate the ancient quiet of the forest. It was the low thrum of heavy engines, the metallic clank of machinery, an industrial symphony utterly alien to this pristine wilderness. These were not the sounds of logging, which he was accustomed to after decades in the area. These were different, more purposeful, more ominous. John, with his ranger's instinct finely tuned to the subtle nuances of his environment, felt a prickle of unease. He started making longer, wider patrols around his property, his movements cautious, almost furtive. He wasn't just looking for game anymore. He was searching for answers. What he found only deepened his apprehension. Unfamiliar tracks, distinct from the broad, flat imprints of snow shadow or the paw prints of deer and bear, began appearing. These were unmistakably human, but they were not the casual tread of hikers or the heavy boot marks of hunters. These were military-grade boot prints, deep and aggressive, often interspersed with the faint, telltale depressions left by specialized heavy vehicle tires. They followed a precise, almost grid-like pattern, suggesting a methodical search rather than a random reconnaissance. They were encroaching, systematic, and entirely out of place. His peaceful coexistence with Snow Shadow, his newfound sense of purpose, suddenly felt fragile, exposed. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that the idyllic bubble he had created for himself and his silent companion was about to burst. The outside world, with its relentless curiosity and its heavy-handed approach, was closing in. He felt a desperate urge to warn Snow Shadow, to somehow communicate the impending danger. But the creature remained elusive, a ghost in the vastness of the forest, its appearances now more cautious, as if it too sensed the shift in the air. Then, one sun-dappled morning, the quiet shattered definitively. A cacophony of roaring engines, grinding gears, and shouting voices erupted from the forest road. John watched, horrified, from the concealment of his cabin window, as a long convoy snaked its way up the barely passable track leading to his isolated homestead. It wasn't a few vehicles. It was an entire retinue: Humvees, armored personnel carriers, and massive military trucks, their dark green paint stark against the muted browns and grays of the winter-worn landscape, lumbered into view. Uniformed personnel, carrying an assortment of weaponry, disembarked with practiced efficiency, fanning out into the surrounding woods. Within minutes, a heavily guarded perimeter was established around his cabin, effectively cutting off his only route out, his only connection to the distant world. John was trapped. A group of soldiers, led by a tall, impeccably uniformed commander with an unyielding gaze, approached his cabin. The commander, Major Thompson, introduced himself with a stiff formality that offered no comfort. His voice was clipped, his questions direct. "Mr. Peterson," he began, his eyes sweeping over John's rustic surroundings, "we've received reports of unusual activity in this sector. Large animal sightings, inexplicable phenomena." He paused, letting the words hang in the crisp air before adding, with deliberate emphasis, "specifically, unidentified biological phenomena." John, his heart pounding in his chest, feigned ignorance, his voice raspy. "Unusual activity? No, Major, just the usual wildlife. Bears, deer, the occasional puma. Nothing out of the ordinary." He kept his gaze steady, refusing to betray the truth, the incredible secret he harbored. He protected Snow Shadow with every fiber of his being. Major Thompson regarded him skeptically, his gaze unwavering. "Our intelligence suggests otherwise. We have satellite imagery, thermal readings, and ground samples that point to something unique. Something large, intelligent, and highly elusive." He pressed further, his tone hardening slightly. "Have you seen anything, Mr. Peterson? Anything at all that doesn't fit the known zoological profile of this region?" John shook his head slowly, maintaining his carefully crafted facade. "Nothing, Major. I'm just an old man trying to live out his days in peace. The cold can play tricks on the mind." The commander did not relent, but his demeanor shifted from interrogation to observation. He left John with a warning to stay inside, not to interfere with their operations, and deployed his troops. From his window, John watched them, a captive in his own home. He began to pick up snippets of their radio communications, terse exchanges filled with jargon. Thermal signature confirmed. Moving towards Sector 7. Target acquisition protocol. Biological anomaly. He pieced together their purpose with sickening clarity. They weren't just investigating, they were hunting. And the quarry, the unidentified biological phenomena, the target, could only be Snow Shadow. His blood ran cold. The military trucks, the armed personnel, the sophisticated equipment, it was all here for his friend. They were not here to observe or understand. They were here to capture, perhaps even to destroy. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. His peaceful existence had not only shattered, but it had now become the unwitting stage for a deadly pursuit. The appearance of the military convoy had shattered John's precarious peace and twisted his newfound purpose into a desperate mission. The rhythmic thrum of their heavy engines, the stark camouflaged vehicles against the pristine snow, and the grim faces of the soldiers had made one thing chillingly clear: Snow Shadow was in grave danger. John knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could not allow them to capture or harm his silent companion. His mind, honed by years of wilderness survival and quick thinking, immediately shifted from the quiet rhythm of sustenance to the urgent strategy of protection. He began meticulously mapping out Snow Shadow's known haunts and likely escape routes in his mind, drawing upon his intimate knowledge of the rugged terrain. He knew the hidden caves, the dense thickets impenetrable to anything but the most determined, and the treacherous, snow-choked gullies that could swallow a man whole. His plan solidified quickly. He would create diversions, lead the military astray, and buy Snow Shadow precious time to disappear into the vast, unforgiving wilderness. First, he started small. He knew the military would be using heat sensors and night vision, so he purposefully left trails of his own scent, dragging old clothes and even a piece of cached meat in directions away from where he suspected Snow Shadow might be bedding down. He built small, smoky fires in remote clearings, allowing the scent to drift on the wind, far from genuine points of interest. These were subtle tricks, designed to sow confusion, to stretch the search grid, and to make the military waste their valuable resources chasing phantoms. The tension in the air was palpable, thick and suffocating like the heavy snowfalls. Drones, mechanical insects of surveillance, buzzed incessantly overhead, their whirring rotors a constant reminder of the encroaching threat. Their infrared eyes scanned the landscape without ceasing, turning the serene forest into a grid of digital suspicion. Search parties, a relentless tide of green and gray, fanned out across the land, their boots crunching ominously on the frozen ground. John, often hunched low, moving like a shadow himself, narrowly avoided detection multiple times. He felt their presence like a physical weight, their methodical invasion a desecration of his sanctuary. He desperately needed to communicate with Snow Shadow, to warn it, to guide it. But how do you warn a creature that speaks no human tongue, that lives by instinct and the subtle nuances of the forest? He resorted to the oldest language, sound. He began leaving specific markers. A broken branch angled a certain way, a particular pattern of scattered stones, at the edges of Snow Shadow's known territories, hoping the creature's intelligence would discern the warning. He also used specific bird calls, ones he'd practiced mimicking for years, to subtly alert Snow Shadow to human presence in various sectors. It was a risky gamble, relying on an intuitive understanding that transcended words, but it was all he had. One frigid afternoon, while tracking a patrol near a particularly dense patch of old-growth pines, John heard the unmistakable sound of shouting, followed by a sharp, guttural roar that echoed through the snow-laden trees. His blood ran cold. It was Snow Shadow. He pushed through the thick undergrowth, his heart hammering against his ribs, the primal fear for his friend overriding all caution. He emerged onto a small, snow-covered clearing just in time to see a military patrol, 5 hardened soldiers surrounding Snow Shadow. The creature, immense and powerful, was backed against a cluster of ancient firs, its broad shoulders heaving, a low growl rumbling deep in its chest. It hadn't attacked, hadn't charged, but its posture was defensive, wary, a magnificent beast cornered. The soldiers, weapons raised, maintained a cautious distance, their faces a mixture of fear and ruthless determination. One soldier was slowly raising a tranquilizer rifle, its long barrel glinting menacingly in the sparse winter light. John knew he only had seconds. He couldn't engage them directly. He was one man against 5, and his actions would surely lead to his own capture and Snow Shadow's immediate sedation. He had to create a distraction, something loud, jarring, and far enough away to pull their attention. Without a moment's hesitation, John reached for the small bag of highly concentrated flares he always carried for emergencies. He pulled one free, twisted the igniter, and hurled it with all his might towards a stand of dry, brittle saplings about 50 yards to the soldier's left, away from Snow Shadow. The flare ignited with a deafening crack and a blinding flash of white light, instantly followed by a thick plume of acrid orange smoke. The sudden explosion shattered the tense silence. The soldiers, startled by the unexpected blast, instinctively flinched, their attention momentarily diverted towards the new immediate threat. "What was that?" one of them yelled, lowering his weapon slightly and turning towards the smoke. The tranquilizer rifle wavered. It was the briefest of windows, a mere flicker of opportunity. But Snow Shadow seized it. With a powerful surge of movement, it launched itself not towards the soldiers, but deeper into the dense, almost impenetrable forest behind it, moving with a speed and grace that belied its massive size. Each powerful stride sent snow flying, and within moments the creature had vanished, swallowed by the labyrinthine depths of the ancient trees. John, hidden in his vantage point, watched Snow Shadow disappear, a surge of adrenaline and relief washing over him. The soldiers, realizing their quarry had escaped, barked frustrated curses, turning their attention back to the direction of the flare, scanning the tree line for whatever had caused the commotion. John, heart pounding, knew he couldn't stay. He had bought Snow Shadow time, but he had also revealed his own proximity. He had to move, and move fast, to avoid becoming the military's next target. He retreated silently, a phantom in the wilderness, the echoes of the flare still ringing in his ears, knowing this close call would only intensify the hunt. The game had just become even more dangerous. John moved through the forest like a ghost, the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, the memory of Snow Shadow's narrow escape replaying in his mind. He knew the soldiers would be furious, their frustration now undoubtedly directed at finding him, the elusive human who dared to interfere with their operation. The winter woods, once his sanctuary, now felt like a vast, cold trap. He pressed deeper, heading towards a network of hidden caves he knew Snow Shadow often used, a place only he and the creature would likely know. It was his last, desperate hope. He reached the mouth of the largest cave system, a jagged opening almost swallowed by snow-laden pines. The air here was colder, carrying a faint, earthy scent. Just as he was about to slip inside, a harsh voice barked from behind him. "Hold it right there! Don't move!" John froze, his shoulders slumping. He had been so close. 6 soldiers emerged from the trees, their weapons not just raised, but aimed directly at his chest. Their faces were grim, their commander's eyes narrowed with a dangerous intensity. This wasn't a search party. This was a capture team. "You've been quite busy, old man," the commander said, his voice laced with menace. "Causing distractions, leading us on a merry chase, interfering with a federal operation. That's a serious offense." "I don't know what you're talking about," John said, his voice raspy, trying to buy time, to appear confused. His gaze flickered towards the cave mouth, a silent prayer forming in his heart. "Don't insult my intelligence," the commander snapped. "We know you've been helping it. We've seen your tracks, your offerings. You deliberately led our patrol away from target." He gestured towards the cave. "Now, where is it? Is it in there?" John remained silent, his jaw set. He met the commander's gaze, defiance hardening his old eyes. He would not betray Snow Shadow. Not now, not ever. "Last chance, old man," the commander warned, taking a step closer, his hand resting on the holster of his sidearm. "Cooperate, and we can make this easy. Refuse, and you'll spend the rest of your miserable life in a federal prison. Or worse, if you continue to obstruct us." The threat hung heavy in the cold air, but John didn't flinch. He thought of the venison stew, the silent understanding, the strange offerings Snow Shadow had left him. He thought of the creature's immense, gentle eyes. He knew he had to stand his ground, no matter the cost. "There's nothing here but me and the cold," John stated, his voice firm, projecting an unwavering resolve he didn't entirely feel. Just as the commander signaled his men to move in, a low rumble started deep within the cave. It wasn't the sound of a rock slide, but something primordial, something alive. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate subtly, a resonance that pulsed through the frozen earth. The soldiers exchanged nervous glances, their attention drawn away from John. The rumble crescendoed into a guttural roar, powerful enough to rattle the icicles hanging from the cave entrance. It was a sound of immense power, of ancient warning, a force that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the wilderness. The soldiers recoiled, raising their weapons defensively, their formation breaking into a ragged line. Then, from the inky blackness of the cave, Snow Shadow emerged. It was larger than John had ever seen it, its silhouette framed by the dense shadows of the cave mouth, seeming to fill the entire opening. Its eyes, luminous even in the dim light, were fixed on the soldiers, but its massive body was positioned directly in front of John, a protective barrier. It wasn't aggressive in the way a cornered animal might be. Rather, there was a profound, unyielding territoriality in its stance, a silent declaration that John was under its protection. Its sheer presence was overwhelming, radiating an ancient power that left the soldiers momentarily stunned, their weapons wavering. The creature's fur, matted with snow and ice, seemed to pulsate with an inner strength. "My God," one soldier whispered, his voice barely audible. It's real." The commander, despite his steely demeanor, took an involuntary step back, his face paling as he stared at the immense creature before them. He had clearly underestimated the situation, or perhaps the intelligence reports hadn't prepared him for the sheer, awe-inspiring reality of the beast. Suddenly, the crackle of a radio broke the tense silence. A voice, urgent and authoritative, spoke through the commander's earpiece. "Commander Davies, stand down. Do not engage. Repeat, do not engage. We have a new directive." The commander, still visibly shaken by Snow Shadow's appearance, brought his hand to his ear. "Sir? What new directive?" "Colonel Hayes is en route," the voice replied. "He's taking over. He wants this handled with extreme care. He has a different approach." As if on cue, the distant thrum of a helicopter grew louder, breaking through the frigid air. A sleek, black military helicopter, far more advanced than anything John had seen before, descended slowly, kicking up a blizzard of snow as it landed a few hundred yards away in a small clearing. From it emerged a solitary figure, tall and austere, adorned with the insignia of a colonel. He wasn't like the other military personnel. There was an intellectual gravitas about him, an almost academic intensity in his gaze. Colonel Hayes approached the standoff, his eyes immediately assessing the scene. John, defiant. Snow Shadow, protective. The soldiers, uncertain. He completely ignored the lower-ranking commander, his attention fixed first on Snow Shadow, then on John. There was a glimmer of something in his eyes, not fear, but a profound and an almost reverent curiosity. "At ease, men," Colonel Hayes commanded, his voice calm but undeniably firm. "Commander Davies, brief me later. For now, lower your weapons, all of them." The soldiers hesitated, but the authority in his voice was absolute. Slowly, reluctantly, their assault rifles were lowered. Snow Shadow remained still, its gaze shifting between the colonel and John, a low, continuous rumble still emanating from its chest. Colonel Hayes finally looked at John, a strange expression on his face. "Mr. John, I presume?" he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You've proven to be an unexpected variable. And your friend here," he nodded toward Snow Shadow, "is far more than the reports suggested." He paused, taking in the full measure of the creature, its raw power, its obvious intelligence. "We've been tracking this creature for years, observing its migratory patterns, its intelligence. We've known its kind existed, but we never anticipated such a bond." He then looked back at John, a thoughtful frown creasing his brow. "Perhaps there's another way to approach this." John melted back into the shadows of the forest, his breath fogging in the frigid air, the distant shouts of the soldiers fading as he put more distance between them. He knew his act of desperation had only delayed the inevitable, but it was a crucial delay, a gift of precious moments for Snow Shadow to escape deeper into the wilderness. He moved with the silent expertise of a seasoned woodsman, his senses heightened, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig registering in his mind. He was no longer just a recluse. He was a protector, a guardian of the wild spirit he had come to cherish. His retreat led him, almost instinctively, towards the hidden cave system, the one he knew Snow Shadow often frequented during the harshest weather. It was a network of ancient basalt fissures, large enough to shelter the creature, and intricate enough to offer multiple escape routes. As he approached the familiar landmark, a grim determination settled over him. He wouldn't just lead them away. He would confront them, face to face, and somehow he would ensure Snow Shadow's safety. He arrived at the main entrance of the largest cave, a gaping maw in the rock face almost entirely obscured by snow-laden pines. The air here was still, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something wild and untamed. Snow Shadow's presence. He didn't have to wait long. The crunching of boots on snow grew louder, more organized. Headlamps cut through the dim light of the forest, converging on his position. He braced himself, a lone man standing guard at the threshold of a secret world. The military patrol, the same one he had distracted earlier, emerged from the trees, their weapons now fully leveled, their expressions grim. The commander, a stout man with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, stepped forward. Well, Mr. John," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Fancy meeting you here. I imagine you know exactly what we're looking for." John met his gaze, his own eyes burning with a fierce defiance. "I know you're looking for trouble," he retorted, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "And you'll find it if you don't turn back." Another soldier, younger, more aggressive, stepped around the commander. "Don't be stupid, old man. We know you've been harboring it. Tell us where it is, and this can be over peacefully." "There's nothing here but rocks and snow," John lied, though his heart hammered. He could feel the vibrations through the soles of his boots, a deep rumbling from within the cave, a telltale sign that Snow Shadow was close, agitated. The commander raised a hand, silencing his subordinate. "We have thermal scans, Mr. John. We know there's something large in there, and we know you're protecting it. Why?" "Because it's not yours to take," John declared, his voice rising, echoing slightly in the frosty air. "It's a living being, a part of this forest. You have no right." Just as the commander was about to give an order, a guttural roar erupted from deep within the cave, a primal sound that shook the very ground beneath their feet. It was a sound of immense power, a warning, and an affirmation. The soldiers instinctively flinched, some stumbling back a step, their formation momentarily broken. Then, from the darkness of the cave entrance, Snow Shadow emerged. It moved with a powerful, deliberate grace, its massive form filling the opening, dwarfing John, who stood before it. The creature was not aggressive, but its posture was unequivocally protective, its large, intelligent eyes fixed on the soldiers, then briefly, reassuringly, on John. Its sheer presence was enough to intimidate, to send a shiver of ancient fear through the armed men. This was not an animal to be trifled with, not merely a specimen to be captured. The standoff hung heavy in the air, a tableau of man and beast, wilderness and civilization, fear and respect. Just as the tension threatened to erupt, the distinct whirring of an advanced helicopter grew louder, descending rapidly from the sky. It wasn't a military combat chopper, but a sleek, specialized craft, its insignia different from the local military units. A figure, impeccably dressed in a government issue but distinctly non-combat uniform, emerged from the helicopter. He was older, with a distinguished bearing and a look of intense, almost scientific curiosity in his eyes. He approached the scene, surveying John, Snow Shadow, and the stunned soldiers. "At ease, Commander," the newcomer commanded, his voice calm, authoritative. He then turned his attention to John and Snow Shadow. "I am Dr. Alistair Finch, and it seems I've arrived just in time." Finch's eyes, sharp and intelligent, studied Snow Shadow with an intensity that bordered on reverence. He had been tracking the creature for a long time, not to harm it, but to understand. He was part of a clandestine division dedicated to studying extraordinary biological phenomena, a division that had more interest in conservation and observation than capture and weaponization. He'd seen the field reports, the conflicting data, and had pushed for a more nuanced approach. The current, aggressive pursuit was not sanctioned by his higher-ups. Finch stepped forward, past the bewildered commander, addressing John directly. "Mr. John, I understand you've formed an unusual relationship with this creature." He paused, glancing at Snow Shadow, who remained steadfast, a silent sentinel. "Our objective has never been to harm it, only to understand. But the methods of this particular unit have become regrettable." A fragile truce was established on the windswept mountainside. Dr. Finch, with unexpected insight, understood the delicate balance at play. He agreed to withdraw the aggressive pursuit, to pull back the bulk of the military presence in exchange for John's cooperation. John would continue his solitary life, but now he would also become an unofficial guardian, an observer. He negotiated a protective buffer zone around his cabin and the known territories of Snow Shadow, a demilitarized zone where the creature could roam undisturbed. Finch would receive periodic, discreet reports from John, relying on his unique perspective and trust. The heavy machinery rumbled away in the following days, the last of the armored vehicles disappearing down the winding mountain road. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, replaced by the familiar hush of the forest. John resumed his routines, but everything had changed. He still walked his land, still chopped his wood, still found solace in the solitude, but now there was a profound understanding that resonated within him, a connection to the ancient pulse of the wilderness and its deepest, most wondrous secrets. Snow Shadow continued its existence, a shadowy presence in the deep woods, occasionally making its quiet visits, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they shared. The military maintained a discreet, distant presence, a few hidden sensors, a rare, almost imperceptible, low-flying drone. But the creature's existence remained a carefully guarded secret, a testament to its elusive nature and John's unwavering protection. John often sat by his window, watching the snow fall, reflecting on the chain of events that had transformed his solitary life into something extraordinary. He thought of the human capacity for fear in the face of the unknown, but also the capacity for wonder, for empathy, for unlikely friendship. He had faced down militarized might, not with weapons, but with loyalty and a quiet conviction. He had protected his unique friend, not out of duty, but out of a deep and abiding respect for life, for the wild heart of the world. He had found a new, deeper sense of peace, a peace forged in the wild, guarded by an ancient, powerful spirit. His cabin, once just a refuge, had become a sanctuary, not just for him, but for a legend. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next adventure. What do you think happened to Snow Shadow after the military left? Let us know in the comments below.